Christian parenting.
When you really think about the act of falling asleep, it is a complete and total loss of control.
That's so good.
It is a surrender to the people around you. It is a trust, because to allow yourself to make that shift, to be completely helpless, to be completely vulnerable, to do all of that, especially for a child who is new in your home, who doesn't know you, who, the unfortunate reality is a lot of our kids that come into our homes had really terrible things happen to them in the dark, when they were left alone for long periods of time, at night. Trigger.
Welcome back, families, to the Call to Love podcast, where, as you know, each week we discuss the practical, sometimes the clinical, and always, and most importantly, the biblical aspects of the foster care and adoption callings. Now, I have a thought that if we were all sitting in a room together today and I asked you to raise your hand if you have struggled with or are currently struggling with sleep issues in your house, I think it's a safe bet to say that everyone, myself included, would raise their hands, but maybe even just like wave them around, not even raise them, but wave them around. Am I right? So today we are talking about how to help your child and your family sleep better as foster and adoptive parents. Joining me for this conversation is Allison Ezell. Allison is a trauma-informed certified pediatric sleep consultant. She's also a wife. She's a bio, adoptive, and foster mom. She knows her stuff, friends, and I'm so excited for you to learn from her today. She serves families by providing the guidance and resources needed to understand the root cause of their children's sleep issues and develop personalized plans that actually work for them. So excited to learn from you today, Allison. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, spoiler alert, y'all, we actually welcomed Allison into our adoption support group locally back in the fall. And so I had the privilege of getting to learn from her. And as soon as she was done teaching this webinar, I was like, we've got to get her on the show. So I'm so thrilled that you're here and can't wait to just dive into all the things. But I always love for our families just get to know our guests a little bit better. So tell us a little bit about your family and the work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So my family is a little bit untraditional. We are a little bit of a gathered nest. A little bit. We kind of come from all over. I was blessed with 2 biological children within the first 3 years of marriage, which was a surprise in and of itself. God is full of surprises, which was a surprise in and of itself. So we have 2 biological children, and after having my daughter, who is now 11, if you would have asked me, are you done? I would have said with a capital D. We are so done. She had colic, reflux, torticollis, never slept. I mean, every single difficult thing almost that an infant can go through.
Yes.
I had gestational diabetes when I was pregnant. I was done with biological children. And the irony in all of that is that I had had some health struggles during high school, and I had been told I was likely infertile. And so my husband and I had actually discussed adoption long before we ever got married. Well, come to find out, of course, because God has a sense of humor, I married a man whose father was adopted at birth as an infant. My grandmother was actually adopted from the foster care system in the 1920s, not the 2020s.
Oh my goodness.
In the 1920s. So we both came into marriage with adoption stories. And so when, we were kind of getting a little bit more serious in our relationship, talking the whole, do you want to have kids? I was pretty honest, and I was like, I would love to have kids, but also I don't know if kind of the traditional way is going to work for me. And I've always really been drawn to adoption. And that is really how I would like to grow my family. And he was like, oh my gosh, me too. And of course. And so then we have these 2 biological kids. We're like, done. We had a boy and a girl, kind of the perfect little American family. Yeah. And so we were like, God, we're done. And God went, that's funny. He
does that.
You don't think that I wrote this story for this to be the ending. And so my daughter turns about a year. We survive the hardest year of our life, her first year. And everywhere we start to look, we start to see what I call little God winks. of adoption. It was kind of like everywhere we looked. And we just kind of began this wrestling. And we were sitting in church, and the pastor was talking about Nehemiah, and he was really relating it to kind of like global issues and social justice issues and things like that. And the whole takeaway was, what breaks your heart? What in the world breaks your heart? And what are you willing to do about it? And so my husband and I go home. We're kind of secretly, come to find out, wrestling individually, not really saying anything to the other, because if you'd asked the other said we're done. And both sort of internally were having this like, but God put adoption on both of our hearts, like, but then he gave it, but we also have these kids, and it was so hard, and but, and then we go through the sermon, we come home, and that night we sit down, and I was like, okay, what was in your mind when the pastor said that question, what breaks your heart? And he goes, kids without families. Absolutely. And I was like, shoot, me too, and
yeah.
We began to sort of pray through, like, okay, what does this mean? My mom always, growing up, my mom always said, I got two hands for two kids. Where would a third go? And so that was sort of in my head of like, what would I do with a third kid? And so we sort of start praying through that, and God just makes it abundantly clear over the next 6 months that international adoption is something he is leading our family towards, growing our family in that way. And so we start researching, and our philosophy with all of the kind of scary things that we've done has been, it's a yes until it's a no. And so we were like, okay, we're going to take a step. And if this is not what we're supposed to do, God will close the door. So our idea has always been, it's a yes until it's a no. So we're going to take the first step. And if that door continues to stay open, we're going to follow that. And so we took the first step. We went to an information meeting. Then we started talking to agencies. Then we started researching different countries, and things like that. So right after my daughter turned 2, literally the day after her second birthday, we started the application. We submitted the application to adopt from China. And so we brought home our son 15 months later. He was born a month after we applied.
Wow.
And so then we went over and we traveled to China for 17 days, and we brought him home. He was 14 months at the time. So we had been in the process for just over 15 months at that point. And so he joined our family in 2016 through international adoption. And again, we're like, okay, we did it. We did the thing.
Yay.
We're done.
Yeah.
Oh my God, 3 kids is so much. And so we're like, that's it. We're done. I'm done. Thank you. Sign on the dotted line. I'm going to stay home for a little bit and just sort of manage, because at the time they were 1, 3, and 5 years old. And so I was spinning. And so we did that, and we were like, okay, check so every time we were in church being challenged to like, step out in faith, we were like, we did. We're good. We did it.
Check that box.
Check the box. We did the scary, hard thing, and we adore him, and he's wonderful. But I'm good. You used me. Like, and I was very humbled, in parenting a child through international adoption, as foster and adoptive parents are. It was not the same at all. Things that had worked for my biological kids did not work for him. And he started going through some sleep struggles when he was around 3. And he is the reason I actually do the work that I do now. He, around age 3, he had always had nighttime grieving. He grieved a lot at night. He was this very happy-go-lucky kid pretty much all day long, easy, funny, silly. And then at night, which I now know doing what I do is very, very common, but at night when like he would slow down enough to really process through his experiences. And if you had a kid in your home that has experienced nighttime grieving, it's a very different soul, deep, guttural cry that will just tear you apart. And he went through this for years. His anxiety, his fear, without getting too deep into his story, he is a child with an abandonment background. So triggers all over the place at night, in the dark, by himself, because in Western, very normal thinking. He had his own room. He had his own bed. We thought he'd
Right.
sleep alone. You know, all of the triggers everywhere.
Yes.
And so I began to sort of start kind of grasping at straws of saying like, okay, I don't know what to do. So we would go to, sleep medicine professionals, and, he did actually have some medical stuff going on that we needed to address. But on top of that, we needed to address the trauma side of things. And
Right.
so I kept just desperately searching for somebody who could help me, because these two sides of the coin were very different. And,
Right.
the sleep medicine doctor was very much pushing sleep training, and the trauma, and, he went to a TBRI therapist, and she
Yeah.
was very much pushing responsiveness and, quickly responding to him, and, all of those good things. And so I'm like, they're in conflict. Nobody
Right.
can make the right hand speak to the left, and I'm getting conflicting advice. And I needed somebody to build a bridge. I needed
Yes.
somebody to build a bridge between sleep science and trauma informed care, and that person didn't exist. She literally didn't exist.
Yes.
And so I just started getting scrappy, because that's what I do. That's what moms do. You just
That's
get
right.
scrappy. And so I just started getting kind of scrappy and taking like, okay, here's what I know, and here's what
Right.
I'm being instructed. How can I amend? Right. And I think this is a little bit where my education background came in. I was a teacher in another life. Um,
Okay.
but how can I take these two things and make them speak to each other? And so I just sort of started getting scrappy, and we made huge strides with him. Big enough strides that when he was about 5, everybody was sort of in a good place. And we'd had a very long time of foster care, foster care, foster care flashing at us.
Okay.
So we sort of got through his difficulties, got into a good place. And then the Lord put foster care on our hearts during the pandemic.
Okay.
And so we joke that our fourth child is our COVID baby. And so we got licensed during the pandemic to do foster care. He was actually born in March of 2020, ironically.
Wow.
And that's about the time when everything kind of came into our hearts of like, okay, thinking through the pandemic, thinking through like who's really suffering um,
Yeah.
through all of this. And, we were so grateful to have kids at home that were safe and healthy and had food and everything they needed. But we were really, really burdened by the kids that weren't, where that
Yes.
wasn't the case, where home wasn't safe.
Yeah.
And so God really put it on our hearts to foster. And so we got licensed during the pandemic, and then he joined us. We were very much not adoption motivated. We truly just wanted to be a safe spot,
Sure.
kind of in passing for kids. And he joined us in May of 2021, right as I started my training for sleep consulting. Literally, I enrolled in June because I'm crazy. And so
Why not?
why not? What's another iron on the fire?
Just add it to the list. Yeah.
I mean, glutton for punishment. So he joined us in May of 2021, and we were one and done. He never left. And, not
Okay.
again, absolutely not our plan. I remember multiple times our agency even asking, are you adoption motivated? And we were like, not at all. Like, we
Yeah.
felt like the 3 that we had were our 3 forever kids. That doesn't exclude us from engaging with the foster care system if we
Sure.
weren't. And we were like, not at all. We truly just want to foster. We want to support reunification. And so that's sort of how all that came about. And then he was adopted in January of 2023. And now we
Wow.
truly do feel done.
Okay.
And we do truly feel like God has put the blessing on that. So
I
we
love
do
it.
truly feel like 4 is our capacity. And I now get to do this work, working with foster and adoptive families and teaching in big groups and teaching one-on-one. And so I get to sort of use all of my experience through the different paths and through my education experience
Yeah.
to help people. So I still get to be super engaged with this community, even though we're not actually an open home anymore. So that was a
I
very long story.
I loved it.
How I got here.
That's so, so good, and I love how you say he's the reason why I do what I do now, and I absolutely echo the same thing with my story. My daughter is the reason why,
Yeah,
and how the
100%.
Lord uses that, and how we have the same heart, and we have multiple failed processes in our story and all the different things, but the Lord clearly showed us you had to experience all those things so that you could help others, and so that's definitely true for you as well, so I think that's just incredible, and listen, sleep, we gotta have it. We are
I mean,
desperate for it. In a quote unquote normal daily life practice, we're already sleep deprived. So then you throw in this factor of the extra of trauma and connection and all of the things. So this is so, so important. And I'm so grateful that you stepped up to be that person to be able to start to minister to families like myself. And I'm sitting here going, where were you 10 years ago when I brought my screaming newborn home who would
right.
not, so I needed you. So I am excited that you get to be a resource for our families listening today. So let me just ask a very broad question, Allison. You take it
Absolutely.
where you want to go. Why is sleep such a struggle for our foster and adoptive kiddos?
So many reasons. Okay, so I think first of all, you have to really understand that sleep is incredibly vulnerable. When you really think about the act of falling asleep, it is
Yeah,
a complete and total loss of control.
that's
It
so
is a
good.
surrender to the people around you. It is a trust because to
Yeah.
allow yourself to make that shift, to be completely helpless, to be completely vulnerable, to do all of that, especially for a child who is new in your home, who doesn't know you, who the unfortunate reality is a lot of our kids that come into our homes had really terrible things happen to them in the dark when they were
That's
left
right.
alone for long periods of time at night.
Yeah.
Trigger, 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 trigger. And so for them,
Yes.
the act of surrendering, of the vulnerability of it is so, so, so hard. I think you also
Yeah.
have to really reframe sleep as a separation. A lot of
Mm,
people don't want to think about it as a separation because you're like, well, I'm just down the hall. And yes, that's true. However, if that child is out of your room, that is still a separation for them. So
yeah.
it is a trigger, it is vulnerable, it is a separation, and it takes a lot of trust for it to feel peaceful and safe and comfortable. And
Yeah.
sometimes I use the illusion if you ever traveled, especially internationally, you are just sort of on guard for the first day or two
Yeah.
that you're there. You don't sleep. Nobody hardly ever sleeps well the first night in a hotel. Those types of things because you just kind of don't know, like, where do I go when I need things? You need time to get your bearings. It's like that
Yeah.
on steroids for kids
Yeah.
just entered your home. They don't know you, they don't know the routines, and not and you didn't even experience a loss when you traveled. So you add loss of all their safe people, all their safe smells. I mean, your home is like a foreign country. And even though
Right.
in your mind you're like, oh, they're finally safe, they're finally comfortable, to them, that's not what that is
That's right.
at all. And so there are just mountains of triggers, and it takes a very long time for them to understand I am safe. I can let my guard down. I can relax. I can trust people. Um,
Yeah.
Depending on their history and why they've come into care, that can be a really, really hard thing.
That is so, so true. What a fantastic way to frame that and help us to understand. Because right there, that just hit me. Just a reminder. And I'm like, I work in trauma informed everything.
Mhm.
And you to say that, that is so profound. So, understanding that, Allison, where do we as parents need to shift our mindset and even our expectations around sleep?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that I always encourage families to do is not to just think my kid should sleep because he's tired, right?
Yeah.
It is so much more than a biological function. Yes, there is physiology, there is biology going on there. And yes, in theory, kids should sleep when they're tired. But I think we have to shift our expectations into understanding that there is so much more, it is so much more complex than just
Yes.
my body needs sleep to survive. There's so much more complexity to it and nuance to it. So if we just look at it as the biological function of sleep and we don't really look at the different pieces of that puzzle, we're not going to serve our kids well because we are simply going to say, like, hey, you have to sleep, period, because you have to. So if that means you have to cry for an hour first, oh well, because you have to sleep. And that's really missing the mark because sleep is there's such an opportunity for bonding and connection and for the attachment relationship, so much of that to grow and develop and bloom in and around sleep periods, right? So much of those routines of preparing our kids' brains and bodies for sleep, so much of that can be really, really such just an opportunity to love them and connect with them. And my kids, they are never sweeter than during their tuck-ins. Now, granted, you can hear a minute. So, when kids still feel like sleep is very much a threatening thing, they may turn not that way. But what an opportunity to really meet them where they are, and to, rather than coming in with a more punitive, like disciplinary approach, to say, hey, I see that this is hard and I'm with you and we're on the same team. I think sleep can become such a power struggle for a lot of families. And it's such an incredible opportunity, if we can view it this way, to really work towards something with your kid instead of against your kid. And to say, okay, what is this need actually, what is this behavior telling me about them, where they're at, what their needs are, and how can I come alongside them as a teammate and encourage them and support them through it, as opposed to fighting about it. Because that tends to be the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, they just got to learn.
Absolutely.
They just need there's so much like unnecessary discipline that happens
Mm.
around sleep. And when you can approach it from that compassionate, teammate side of things, it just goes so much better.
That is so, so good. So, yeah, I'm hearing all of that. I agree 100%. And I'm thinking, because I definitely was the knee jerk, the more disciplined, the frustration, you've been pouring out, pouring out, pouring out. The high need remains during the daytime hours, and you just need a break as a parent.
Mm-hmm.
But understanding everything that you're saying, and I'm going to make an assumption here, and I want you to speak into this. The more we lean into the approach that you're describing for us, and I want you to get specific in just a moment,
Yeah.
it seems like that's going to alleviate
Mm-hmm.
and lessen the time frame of frustration and disruption rather than keeping it going. So that being said, give us some practical things for those nighttime disruptions, for the insecurities, for the triggers, for the behaviors that nobody's sleeping tonight, in
Yeah.
other words, because it's just not happening. What are some practical things that you would advise parents to lean into? And obviously, we know that it's going to get very specific in the work that
Right.
you do, but just some general things that would help us kind of lean into a better response to help the kids feel safe sooner so
Right.
that they actually can trust and sleep.
Right. A lot of times parents, when they reach out to me, their first question to me is, how can I stop doing XYZ? How can I
Yeah.
stop rocking to sleep? How can I stop
Yeah.
laying with my child to sleep? How can I stop doing that? And what I really think is a very, very powerful tool is to take a reframe away from how do I stop doing these things to what can I add to my child's toolbox? Because when
Mm,
kids are equipped with the tools that they need to succeed, when they know better, they do better. And if the
absolutely.
only thing that your kid knows is mommy lays with me until I fall asleep, of course they're going to freak out when you try to stop doing that. You
Sure.
have to add before you subtract. So
That's good.
layering in new, these are going to be age specific, but age
Yeah.
specific, age appropriate things for them to help them fall asleep, right? So I talk a lot about sleep associations. So sleep associations are essentially the conditions around somebody when they fall asleep. And these are an incredibly powerful thing
Yeah.
for our kids. So sleep association, so if you think about it, a child who is rocked to sleep, that child is rocked to sleep. They are held in their parents' arms. They are actively moving. A lot of times they have milk in their mouth or a parent's hand is patting them, and they fall asleep in that space. They are then transferred into a place that is unmoving with no parent present, with no milk, those types of things. So when they wake up later in the night, they panic, right? Because they
Right.
don't remember that happening. It would be like one of
Yeah.
us falling asleep on a pillow, waking up a few hours later and the pillow is gone,
Yeah.
right? So when we lay with our children to sleep and they wake up either coming into our room later or needing us to come back into their rooms, their pillow is gone. And that pillow is you,
Yeah.
right? So
That's good.
I think some of the most powerful things that we can do for our kids is to gift them tools, put tools in their toolbox. I love audiobooks. I love like the Yodo player and things like that for kids that are like 3 plus. Every
Okay.
single night, my 4-year-old son, he's gonna be 5 later this month, he goes and it's one of his favorite things in the world to pick out his card and he puts it in his player and this is all him. It is
Yeah.
his tool and it
Love
helps
that.
him because he is a very busy kid. And so it helps him if he has, it's called a focal point, right? If he
Yep.
has something to focus on, and he knows we have our routine now, so he puts his card in. I sit with him. I sit at the end of the bed for 5 minutes, roughly. I sit for about the first chapter of whatever book he's got on, and then I walk out. But he has another tool. He's not freaking out about me walking out and coming back in because I have gifted him a tool. He has an
That's great.
audiobook, he has a comfort item, and he knows that I'm going to come back and check on him because I do every single night. And the
Right.
repetition and the time and the trust was built there, right? And
Yes.
so I have no problem. I know some consultants may disagree with me, but I have no problem if in the middle of the night he were to wake up and say, "Hey, I'm struggling to go back to sleep. What could I do?" Right? This is the toolbox. What tools
Sure.
do I have? Oh, well, my Yoda player's right there. I could put another card in and it could help me fall back asleep. And I've watched him do it. And I've
Mm.
watched him do that. When kids have tools to pull from, they use them. And
That's
so that's
good.
one of my big things is that I'm always wanting to say add. What can we add? Can we add a comfort item? Can we add an audiobook? Can we add, if you're trying to get away from holding a child to sleep and then making the transfer,
I love
what
it.
could we add, right? While you're holding them, could we add a back scratch? Get them really used to the back scratch because that is transferable. Because then
That's
once you
good.
lay them down in their own sleep space, you can do that back scratch right next to the crib. But if we don't add it in the situation they're already comfortable in first, they're going to reject it. Does that make
Mm.
sense? So you have to build
Absolutely.
the attachment to it in their comfort zone and then implement it in a different space. So it's all about like what tools can we give our kid because there's nothing worse in my opinion than especially for kids like we have in our homes than ripping something away from them cold turkey and leaving
Yes.
them to flail like a fish, right? Leaving them like a fish out of water. If you just pull that pacifier away from them cold turkey, that's their tool. That's the only
Yeah.
tool they have. And if you don't give them something new before you pull, if you don't add before you subtract, they're going to be left feeling very vulnerable and very powerless. And that's the last thing kids like this need to feel.
Oh, that is fantastic. What great advice. I love that. And so, so practical.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you base it on your kid. I think about my own children. Like my oldest, we used to play, there was a certain CD at the time that it was praise and worship music, and it was like the bedtime, very peaceful. And so my daughter definitely struggled, same as your son, abandonment, anxiety, fear.
Mhm.
She would be fine during the day. And as soon as we said bedtime, that was a trigger word for her. And she lost her ever loving mind because it
Yep.
scared her to death.
It's the
And so
worst.
I would offer to play the praise and worship music. Well, guess what? She also grieves at night. So that type of somber music she associates with sadness. And so that was a bad idea for us to even try to introduce that. And now she's old enough, she can read on her own. Reading is her tool.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yep.
but we also are very predictable with bedtime and we've built that over time. But listen, trial and error, guys. And it is trial and error. You have to learn your child
Yes.
and you do not have to get the right approach right off the bat and
Right.
think, okay, I've failed if I haven't done that. You want to speak into that a moment, Allison?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a difference between inconsistency and trial and error because
Yeah.
sometimes I'll get families that like when I say, okay, they wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, what do you do? If they
Yeah.
start that next sentence by saying, well, sometimes I stop and I'm like, hold up. Think from your child's perspective about, well, sometimes. I woke up in the middle of the night. I'm feeling terrified. I don't know what to expect from my parent because sometimes they come in quickly. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they're frustrated. Sometimes they're loving. That,
Yeah.
well, sometimes can be the problem in and of itself. So
That's great.
I think there's such a difference between trial and error of saying, okay, we are going to respond in exactly the same way, right? Consistency is so big
Yes.
in the structure piece of felt safety. It is so
Yeah.
big for kids. And I think there's a difference between saying, okay, let's try responding this way for several weeks. It's not going to work on the first time. And I
Yes.
get a lot of families who are like, well, sometimes we do this, but one night I did this and it didn't work at all. So we've never done that again. Well, maybe we, maybe we needed to try a little longer, right? It
Right.
takes time and repetition to build processes, right? To build neurological
Yeah.
processes. So for them to come to expect, yeah, you did something totally off the wall one time. Of course they were thrown by it because
Right.
they didn't know what you were doing, right? And so
Absolutely.
that's why I always say build comfort with anything new in the state that they're comfortable in, and then work on moving it towards to be the priority, right? So if you're wanting to move towards a back scratch instead of holding a child to sleep, using that in the held position, letting them build attachment to it there, and then transferring. And I think every kid is going to respond differently. I talk a
Sure.
lot, especially with the older kids, about focal points. And there are different focal points, visual focal points, right? Like I love those star projectors that like they have to get flat on their back to see. That's a big thing.
Yeah.
They can see it
Yeah.
sitting up. It's not going to work. They got to be on their
That's right.
backs to see it above their heads, right? I love focal points like visual ones, lava lamps, fish tanks with lights. This is all age dependent. Obviously, don't put a
Yes.
fish tank in a toddler's room.
Right.
Those. I feel like I always have to give a disclaimer.
Yeah, it's important.
It is important. Those types of things that they can visually pay attention to for calming. Auditory, whether that's music. And I think you're a great example of trial and error. We typically think of the slow, somber lullaby type music as being what they need. That is absolutely not the case for every kid. I have kids that are on the autism spectrum, and white noise is a fixation. It is not helpful for them. They fixate on it. And so they need a silent room in order to be able to turn off and fall asleep. So there's so much trial and error involved. But I think what I would encourage families to do is to go through that trial period in the context of something that's already safe and comfortable, and before moving on with it and seeing how your child responds. But there is such a difference between inconsistency and trial and error, and I think that's sometimes the slippery slope. Families that just feel like, well, I've tried everything. Well, how long have you tried? How many chances did you take? There's a difference between I've tried everything and I did a new thing every night for a week and now my kid's a mess. Well, consistency breeds felt safety. So when everything is just wildly inconsistent and unpredictable, that especially if you have a kid that has some instability in their history, if they've been to multiple homes, if they've been to multiple caregivers, if they had a big loss of a caregiver, that is going to be a very deep seated trigger for them.
Yeah. Oh, that is such good advice. I love that, and I'm so thankful. That was not in the notes, guys. Like, that is such an
Off
important
script.
distinction. So good. That's why I always tell people, I'm like, "I trust the Lord to lead the conversation." Like, I needed to hear that. You guys needed to hear that. That is so, so helpful, and it does, because I cannot tell you, Allison, I know you hear the same thing, of how many foster parents and adoptive parents that I hear, they come to me and they're like, "I just feel like I'm failing.
Mhm.
Like, nothing I do is right. I feel like I fail." So then their confidence dwindles, and our children pick up on that.
Mhm.
And so it's just this crazy cycle of defeat and frustration and chaos,
Yeah.
that when we just need that piece to piece it together to provide that stability and that positive cycle rather than the negative one. So that is such a key point. I love that. And of course, we're talking about the nighttime stuff, but really and truly, it starts in the daytime
100%.
as well.
Yes.
So I want to talk about that for a moment, of things that we need to be mindful of during the day that can contribute to either a positive or a negative sleep experience at night.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to build on what you said about confidence, lack of confidence that the parents have, a lot of the issues that I see with kids, it's a lack of confidence in the kids. And
Yeah.
I think lack of confidence in the parents, when the kids pick up on that energy, like, oh, I'm too hard, I'm too much, that hurts
Yes.
their confidence. And
Yes.
there's so much too that I see with kids, especially with like kids that don't want to be alone in their room. There's a lack of separation confidence. They
Yeah.
don't feel like, if I am alone, if my mom is in the other room, I cannot function. And
Right.
so a lot of times we do start during the day. So I work a lot on building separation tolerance with families. And we always start with like 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, right after pancakes. Like there's
Yeah.
no threats. We are not operating from the downstairs brain at all. We have a warm belly. We know sleep is nowhere near. There is no threat. And at that point, we'll go in. And one of my big things that I think all families should do is spend time in your child's sleep space at non sleep times. And
Okay.
the reason that is so powerful is because, like you said, for your daughter, the word bedtime was a trigger. My son's
Yeah.
room was a trigger for
Okay.
years. We would just start walking towards it because if you think about the way that, kids wake up in the morning, especially if they've had a hard night, they get up, they get dressed, they get out of that room. And if
They
they
do.
don't take naps, or they take naps at daycare or school, guess what? They're not back in that room until it's time to sleep again.
Right.
So the room itself does not feel safe.
Yeah.
This is a space where I grieve. This is a space where I have nightmares. This is a space where I cry. This is a space where mom leaves me. This is a
Mm.
space that's dark all the time. They never see it in the light of day. And
Wow.
so it can very much become, the room itself becomes a threat because of the things that happen in there. And so one of the most powerful things that I think that just every parent should just, it's just good practice, is going into that sleep space with your child during low stress, non-threatening, non-sleep related times, getting
Good.
down on the floor with them and playing
Yeah.
with your kids in their rooms at non-sleep times, because then that space isn't just, this is where I'm set, this is where I'm alone, this is where I'm scared, this is where I'm sad. No, this is also where mommy and I play Uno. This is
That's great.
where we had a tea party. We got on my bed and we played, WrestleMania with my stuffed animals, right? Whatever it is that your kid responds to, right?
Yeah.
It becomes a place that they don't dread going. And
Yep.
if you really want to take it up a slightly bit from that, so this is where I start with a lot of families, because a lot of times it's about sleep, but really it's about separation. And so
Yes.
we got to get down to the foundation, right? Yes, you want to sleep at night, but we got to go back a lot of steps and just make your kid feel comfortable in their room. And
Spot
sometimes
on.
it's just they don't even want to cross the door. They don't even want to go in there. So we have to go in there and we have to do some positivity in there, right? We have to have some
Yeah.
placement, some connection time. Child-led play is super powerful. I talk about that a lot. But we got to go in and do that. And then once that becomes norm and they're happily skipping into their room to have special mommy playtime,
Right.
and what I like to do is I like to sort of like start dipping your toe in the water of like, hey, what if you left your water bottle just down the hallway? And while your kid was really engaged with their magnetiles or whatever it is that they're playing with, what if you said, hey, I'm going to run and grab my water just down the hallway. I'll be right back. And then you
Yeah.
go down, and your kid's like, okay, that's fine. They don't care because they
Right.
know walking down the hallway and coming back is a 10-second activity. There's
Right.
no threat there. There's no, I'll be back in 5 minutes. There's no, see you in the morning. There's no abstract, it's a very concrete, tangible thing that they can
Yeah.
process. And so then you walk out of the room, which for a lot of kids is a trigger, but they're engaged in their play. They're redirected. They've maybe even been given a job. Can you put 3 more
Right.
blocks on our tower while I grab my water bottle? Come
Yes.
back with the water bottle. They waited patiently for you, and you say, oh my gosh, I love what you did with the tower. Thank you for waiting so patiently for me while I grabbed my water. They experience success, and that
That's
builds
good.
confidence. And for a lot of our kids, that's the foundation. We have to just start there.
Yeah.
They have to be okay with watching us walk away for a brief second and know that they're still safe and find
Yeah.
confidence in our return, and to meet that with praise, and to meet that with praise of saying, oh my gosh, I love what you did. That's so amazing. You waited so calmly and patiently. How brave you are, right? And then you can build from there, right? So then that can translate into a bedtime routine while they're looking at a book or while they're listening to a story or listening to a song. You can do the same thing. Hey, let me go grab this thing in the other room. And then when they're already, antennas are up because the hypervigilance is kind of kicking in
Yep.
because it's nighttime, they have had experience with you doing this. And so it doesn't feel like a threat because they've experienced success and they know that you're going to come back and that they're still safe in that interim and that
Yeah.
you can build it, right? But a lot of times you have to strip it all the way back in order to build back up because the foundation just isn't there. And you
Yeah.
can't build on the house when there's no foundation.
Exactly.
So
That is,
so much of it starts in the day.
it does. That's so, so good. And I'm sitting here, I'm listening to you talk about this, and I'm remembering how I was counseled to parent my now 18-year-old biological son. And it was the cried out method. Like that was the thing back in the day when we were parenting. And I'm sitting here going, oh my gosh, I hate myself as a mother because we totally did
No.
that, you know? And so you do, but like we carry those things. And so as you're talking about these things, I'm thinking for myself and maybe the families who are listening were like, listen, Allison, we built some bad habits in our house, whether it's the negative experiences we don't realize have been negative experiences for our kids, or we followed different advice. That tension you were talking about earlier between one person's telling me to do this and trauma's telling me to do this. I don't know how to balance it all, and I'm just messing it all of it up. And we've built some really bad habits. Maybe our kids are older
Yeah.
and they've settled into something. So where do we even begin to approach reframing and restructuring from a place of bad habits?
Yeah, yeah. I think first of all, you have to really look at your kid and say, okay, what are their actual sleep needs, right?
Yeah.
Because there are, I mean, sleep deprivation, if you've got that going on in your kid, I mean, sleep deprivation has dramatic effects. I mean,
Yes.
mental health, I mean, I could go on for a while about that. Learning issues, executive functioning problems, mental
Yeah.
health, immunity, growth and development. I mean, there's sleep deprivation is a torture device for a reason, right? Like it is
Yeah.
really hard. So
Right.
when you get into a place where you and or your child is operating from a place of sleep deprivation, I think you have to first step back and say, okay, none of us are at our best, right? And we have to make this a priority for our family because none of us are operating at an optimal level. And
Right.
so you first have to make the decision, number one, this is important to us. I think there's a lot of tendency in the world that we live in today to say sleep when you're dead. And whatever, just get
Yes.
through it, go to all the sports, enroll in all the things, do everything to everyone, and oh well, who cares about sleep?
Yeah.
And I think doing that, sometimes we're kind of cutting off our foot to spite our face, right? Or whatever that
Yes.
saying is. I
That's
said that
right.
wrong. But you know what I'm saying? You're kind of
Yes.
shooting yourself in the foot a little bit there.
Absolutely.
And you're not getting the version of your child that you possibly could. So I think you first have to kind of say, okay, how much sleep does my child actually need? And some people don't know. There are a lot of people who just frankly don't know. Like, oh, you mean my toddler isn't supposed to sleep the same numbers I do? What? And so some of it is just like you need a basic understanding of sleep science.
It's a
And,
great point.
one of my professional goals is to get that into the hands of every prospective foster and adoptive family. Because if you have come to foster and adoptive parenting without parenting biological kids first, you
Yeah.
maybe don't know. You maybe don't have a clue. And if you have a
Yeah.
foster placement for the first time in your home and that's your first experience parenting at all, you truly may not know about things like naps and
Yeah.
sleep pressure and wake windows and things that you're like, I don't know. She just spoke a foreign language. I don't know what any of that means.
Right.
And there's no training because other than SIDS, there's literally no pre-service training about this. So
That's
I
right.
think for families that have found themselves in a place, and I don't necessarily believe personally in bad habits per se, but I do believe that a lot of families come to a crossroads where they say this is no longer sustainable.
Mm.
Because I'm a big believer in if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If it's
Yeah.
working to lay with your child for an hour every night and they're getting the sleep that they need, you're getting the sleep that they need, I don't go looking for problems that don't exist.
That's
But
good.
if, but if you are in a place that says, I wanted to co sleep, I've waited my whole life to have this child, I went through, 5 years of infertility, I just want to hold my baby close all the time, and I loved co sleeping, but we're 6 months in and I haven't slept more than 2 hour stretch since they came home and I just can't anymore. Right. I'm a
Right.
big believer you do what works until it doesn't work anymore. And then when
Sure.
things feel unsustainable, that's a good time to start really looking at it and say, okay, what needs to change? So
That's
if
good.
you're in that space, I would say number one, figure out what your child's sleep needs actually are. And there's a huge range there. Sleep needs are primarily genetic. There's not a whole lot that we can do to influence them. There are kids with higher sleep needs, lower sleep needs, and then kind of average sleep needs. And
Interesting.
so there is a big range there, and it is primarily genetic. Now, we can nurture and support, you know, the average there. But if you have a child that is, genetically wired with lower sleep needs, comparing them to, some influencer who's like, my kids all slept 12 hours at 12 weeks, that's not going to serve you.
No, 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 not at all.
You can't create kids that don't exist, right? You have
Yes.
to parent the kid right in front of you as opposed to comparing to typical anything.
Great point.
um
Yeah.
and so that's not going to serve you. So I think number one, you need to get really honest about what are my kids actual sleep needs. And one of the best ways to do that is to keep a log. Your kid doesn't even really have to know you're doing it, especially if they're a
Yeah.
little older, but really
Sure.
looking and saying how much sleep are they getting, and then what is the range of normal for their age. Are they falling anywhere near it? Is it
Yeah.
super low? Is it super high? And then saying, okay, are there medical issues, especially for older kids? Is anything medical underlying? And I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to get into all of that stuff. But if there's anything medical going, not sticking your head in the sand and just saying, like, no, 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 they're just scared, but really
Mhm.
taking action. I mean, I said in the beginning, my son's issues were a two-sided coin. He had
Right.
medical and he had trauma. And so to only focus on the trauma side and to only work on behavior would not have served him because he had an underlying sleep disorder. So
Yeah.
we have to address the medical. Don't be afraid to address the medical,
Yeah.
but also remember that it is a two-sided coin because you
Yeah.
can't medicate away trauma.
That's
So,
a great
it
point.
always has to be a two-sided coin. You have to address the medical and the behavioral and the emotional and the trauma. But get real honest
Excellent
about
point.
that. Keep a log. Make sure you've addressed any of those medical conditions, and then get to a point where you say, okay, XYZ is not sustainable for us anymore, and say what would be. How could we take where we're at and move in the direction of where we ideally want to be, and be realistic about that. I always
Mhm.
encourage foster and adoptive families to have micro goals, right? As opposed to thinking like, well, right now they're co-sleeping 24/7. They only nap, they only contact nap, and they sleep with me all night. But I really want to just be able to lay them down, walk away, and they just sleep 12 hours. Like,
Right.
there's so much between here and there.
Yes.
That's a
So
huge
true.
jump. So,
Yep.
how could we make little moves? Maybe they just take their nap in another room for a couple of months. That's a big step, right? Then maybe we start doing the bedtime routine in the room, but then we go to our bed. Then we
Right.
start doing the first stretch of the night in their room, and then we allow them to come in when they need to. How can we have micro goals
That's
towards
great.
where we need to go? So I think it's understanding the science of it, understanding what my kids' actual needs are, and then kind of reverse engineering. Say, here's where we're starting, here's where we want to get. What micro steps do we need to take to move from there to there? And if that is something
Mm.
that you just can't wrap your brain around, how do we get from point A to point B? Then that's where reaching out for some help can be right.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what you're here for. That's so good. And I love that you break that down. And then it goes back to that expectations conversation we were having a few minutes ago of just we can't identify the problem, try a couple of things and expect to be on the other side of it. It really is. And here's the thing, the time is going to go by regardless.
Yes.
So it's the experience of the time in between in that process. Do you want it to be a positive experience for everybody involved, or do you just want to keep beating the dead horse essentially, and doing the negative definition of insanity, the same thing over and over again and wanting a different result. So I think that's really, really helpful just to gain perspective in all of that. I know that we have a listener, Allison, and I want to ask this question on behalf of them. I've been there. This goes all the way to the blocked care conversation that we've had and are going to have going on this year with Lisa Sequals. But they're struggling
Yeah.
to connect with their child. They're struggling to like their child. They're struggling to bond with their child, to be affectionate and gentle and kind all hours of the day because they're resentful because the
Yeah.
sleep issues are so out of control and it is hindering their bond and moving forward in relationship with their child because of the lack of sleep in their home. How would you encourage those parents?
First of all, I would say I was you. I didn't have words for it 5 years
Yeah,
ago.
me neither.
My son is now 9.
Mm,
I didn't have words for it 5 years
yep,
ago. I'd never heard the words blocked care. I'd never heard the words secondary trauma. I didn't know. I didn't know that's what I was going through. I did know I had what they called at the time post adoption depression. I knew that. I knew I had that. And I thankfully found a therapist who could help me walk through that. But I would say, number one, first and foremost, you are not alone. This is so common. It's really hard when your child gets up in the morning to be excited to see them if you haven't had a chance to miss them. If you haven't had a chance to, you know, have a minute, there is some truth in absence makes the heart grow fonder. When they have just been all up in your business, and especially for stay at home moms, where they are just all up in your business all the time, all day and all night, even if this is a child that you have prayed and waited years and years and years for, it is so normal. It is so normal to still say, I love this child because they're mine, but I'm having a really hard time liking them today because they have turned my world upside down and I don't know that it will ever be the same again. And I want to say two things to that, mom. One, it's okay. It's okay to feel that way. It's okay to feel that way. It's okay to admit that this is harder than you thought it was going to be. It's okay to admit that this is not the picture you had in your mind for all those years and years and years and years, that this turned out differently. That was our story too. My son had a room that went unused for 5 years. He never went in it. We got to a point where we just said, he can't do this. And we had to reframe our expectations to say, okay, I think one of the most powerful things that the therapist ever said to me about my son was, I think you need to grieve the loss of what you thought this was going to look like. You need to grieve that. Wash your face, grieve it. And this is a quote from somebody, I'm Jason Johnson, maybe. Grieve the life that you thought you were going to have. Wash your face and look at the life you have right in front of you, right? Put your next foot forward and to say, it's not always going to be this hard. It won't. It is not always going to be this hard. It is, there will come a day where you look back and you say, oh my gosh, look what I went through. And I walk families through that every single day. I would say educate yourself on blocked care. Make sure, and I know it's hard, and I know people are going to throw a lot of excuses at this, but make sure you have breaks. If your breaks aren't coming overnight, find a trusted friend, find a relative, find a Mother's Day Out program, even if it's just for 2 or 3 hours, 1 or 2 days a week. Give yourself a minute to just be you, not mom. Yes, just to be you. Find a gym with childcare. Find a MOPS group that will love on your baby for 2 hours while you go sit in the company of adults, right? Get out of your little bubble and find places to go so that you don't lose yourself in that. Find things that bring you joy. Go for walks. Use your spouse if that's the only person you have right now. Go for walks, those types of things. Take care of yourself because it won't always be this hard and you will get through this. You will survive. I just wish someone could have held my head in their hands at 3 in the
Yes.
morning next while I cried and he cried and been like, there will come a day when it's
Yes.
not this hard. But right now you are in the trenches with your child and just being there with them is going to pay dividends, and supporting them through that, you will get to the other side of it. And I know it
Yeah.
doesn't feel that way, but you will, and you're strong and you'll realize your strength in the process.
That's so true. Oh my goodness. What fantastic advice. And same, I'm like, "Oh, I needed you 10 years ago. I needed you 5 years ago, I needed you last summer." No. But I can definitely attest to what you're saying that we sat in the hardest of hard for the longest time,
Yes,
and it is a lonely and exhausting
it's
place,
so
and so
lonely.
you have to drudge up any ounce of fight that you have in you to follow the advice that you just gave us, and I think it is sound advice. It is so needed, and leaning into the Lord and asking him for that community, that support, those moments of rest. They may not, to your point, they may not look like you would hope they would. You may not get this long extended period where you get to go away on this amazing Instagram worthy vacation.
Exactly.
But my goodness, 2 hours in the car with a book by yourself,
Yeah.
where the high need is not there for
Yeah.
just that amount of time is enough to keep you going. And that is such an encouraging word. I
And
love
don't try
that.
to be superwoman. I think for the longest
Yes.
times, I was just like, I can't burden anybody, especially with
Yes.
foster care and adoption, because it's like you signed up for this. You asked for
Yes.
this. And I think
That's right.
that's such a tendency too of people to look at you and say, but you wanted this. You worked
Say it.
hard
Yep.
for this. So
Yep.
you can't admit that this is hard because you signed up for it. Yeah. Yeah, we did. But also, we need you. We need
Yes.
the village, and it is not a burden. People want to come alongside you and love your baby and
For
let them. Let
yes.
I am the worst. My therapist will tell you I am the worst person in the world at asking
Yep.
for help. But
Yep.
I have really learned 4 kids will humble you like that. It is
So true.
it is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of strength. And some people have a hard time talking to me, getting help, getting a therapist, or even just asking for a neighbor to come. A grandma who lives next door who would love to hold a baby for a couple hours that
Yes.
would make their day. It is
Yes.
not a burden. Use your
Yes.
village and don't try to do this alone.
Love that. And I was like waving my hand as you were talking about being the
Yes,
world's worst. And we are. And I think we're conditioned in our current society to be that way. And we've got
100%,
to counter that with the truth. I mean, literally, one of the attributes of God Himself is helper. And so
100%.
that ought to tell us something that He is our helper and He builds us, He designed us for community
Yep,
to help one another. So we've got to lean back into that and ignore the lies of what culture and society says that we have to be, because we have taken on a hard thing, but nobody asked us to do it alone.
exactly.
So fantastic, fantastic reminder. Y'all, I listen, we could talk for hours on end. And I am just, Allison, I am so grateful for everything that you've shared with us over this conversation. It is just so impactful in so many ways. And y'all, there's some of y'all here that need to reach out to Allison. I know you're like, okay, this is fantastic and I want more. So Allison, I want to make sure that they can get in touch with you and know more about your courses, your personalized coaching. How can they do that?
Absolutely. So I am Dwell Pediatric Sleep. That is the name of my company. DwellPediatricSleep.com is my website. I am Dwell Pediatric Sleep on pretty much every social except TikTok, because when they banned it, I was like, I'm not getting back on.
Right?
I got weirded out by that, so I'm not on TikTok anymore. But Instagram is my favorite place to hang out. I do weekly Q&As. I got tons of links there. I have digital resources. I do one-to-ones, all kinds of content, help, whatever you could need. DwellPediatricSleep.com or Dwell Pediatric Sleep on any social media site.
Excellent. Okay. That is how we first discovered you, my team and I. And so we are so thankful that we did and that you have blessed us with your time in this conversation today. Friends, I will have those links in today's show notes so that you can reach out to Allison. You can learn more from her. And I just want to say thank you so much for the work that you do and just for how you have encouraged me today and our listeners. And I just am so grateful for your time. Thank you for being my guest today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to Called to Love today. I love to hear from listeners, and so I would love to connect with you to hear your stories and answer your questions right here on the show. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram, send me a direct message, or send me an email at the link in today's show notes. I pray you have been encouraged by today's episode to walk in faith and continue to embrace your own call to love. Until next time, blessings, sweet friends.